Specifically, this module will review key points from prior training on obviousness, discuss obviousness as it relates to preponderance of evidence, and provide examples of obvious and non-obvious claims across different technical areas, bearing in mind that each case is decided on its own facts. Finally, we will look at examples of cases discussing consideration of evidence. All examples are included from the 2010 Examination Guidelines Update. In addition to MPEP Sections 2141 through 2146, reference materials for this module are available on the USPTO's public website titled Examination Guidelines and Training Materials in View of KSR International Company versus Teleflex Incorporated. In 2007, the Supreme Court's decision in KSR reaffirmed the familiar framework for determining obviousness as set forth in its 1966 Graham v. Deere decision. As a reminder, the Graham v. Deere analysis requires the evaluation of the following factual inquiries: the scope and content of the prior art, the differences between the claimed invention and the prior art, the level of ordinary skill in the art, and secondary considerations. The 2010 Examination Guidelines Update was intended to clarify obviousness analysis in view of decisions by the Federal Circuit between 2007 and 2010. Also remember that, regardless of the rationale or reasoning being used, every obviousness rejection requires appropriate findings of fact, a reasoned explanation, and a legal conclusion of obviousness. The standard to be applied in all rejections is the preponderance of the evidence test. The ultimate determination of patentability is based on the entire record, by a preponderance of evidence with due consideration to the persuasiveness of any arguments and any secondary evidence. Thus, an obviousness rejection should only be made or maintained if evidence of obviousness outweighs evidence of non-obviousness. In other words, an examiner should reject the claim if, in view of the prior art and evidence of record, it is more likely than not that the claim is unpatentable. If applicant submits secondary evidence in support of non-obviousness, the examiner must re-evaluate all the evidence rather than limiting the evaluation to only the knockdown effect of the secondary evidence. Examples of this concept will be explained further in later slides. MPEP 2143 discusses 7 exemplary rationales to support obviousness. The rest of this module will focus on examples of rationales A, B, and E, and of consideration of evidence. All examples come from the 2010 Examination Guidelines Update. Remember that the list of rationales suggested by the KSR decision are not meant to be an all-inclusive list. You can use other rationales to support a conclusion of obviousness. The cases chosen in the 2010 Examination Guidelines Update provide examples of both obvious and non-obvious claims. The technologies and rationales included are those most thoroughly discussed in the cases between the KSR decision in 2007 and issuance of the Examination Guidelines Update in 2010. The 2010 Examination Guidelines Update includes an appendix listing example cases along with teaching points drawn from a case. It is important to note that these teaching points are not a complete discussion of the case, and examiners are encouraged to read the entire court decision. We'll begin with examples of rationale A. To reject the claim based on the rationale of combining prior art elements, you are required to provide a reason to combine the prior art elements, which can include a common sense reason with sufficient explanation. A finding of non-obviousness may be appropriate if a recognized reason for combining elements does not exist, even if the components are known and combining is feasible and predictable. One such example discussed in the 2010 Examination Guidelines Update is in the matter of omeprazole. It was found that the pharmaceutical formulation having 2 layers of coatings over the drug omeprazole was non-obvious, even though the elements were known in the art and the combining steps were feasible. In this example, the prior art taught the coating materials and method for applying such coatings, a single layer coating over an omeprazole formulation, and using coating and subcoatings, although not specifically for omeprazole. So why was the 2-layered omeprazole formulation non-obvious? It was non-obvious because the patentee discovered that the single-layered omeprazole was subject to degradation and a subcoating could reduce degradation. Without a recognition of the problem in the prior art, one of ordinary skill would have had no reason to add a subcoating even though it would have been feasible. The lesson here is that even though a general method is known and within the level of skill of the ordinary artisan, if the problem suggesting the use of the known method is not recognized, the invention may be non-obvious. Another example of rationale A is Crocs Incorporated versus U.S. International Trade Commission. The claim was directed to a foam footwear which has a foam base and foam heel strap that could pivot and yet maintain a desired position behind the user's heel as a result of friction. This was held to be non-obvious even though molded foam footwear, except for the strap, and a flexible heel strap were known in the prior art. Here is the figure of the claimed invention, Crocs. Here are the figures of what was known in the prior art. The figure at left shows the flexible heel straps. The figure at right shows molded foam footwear. So why were Crocs found to be non-obvious over these figures? First, the prior art did not teach foam heel straps or the straps in contact with the foam base. Second, the prior art taught that the friction between the foam base and heel strap was not desired and taught the use of washers to reduce this friction. Remember, the claimed invention used friction to maintain the desired position behind the user's heel. Therefore, even though the prior art taught all the elements, the combination of the elements provided a result that was not predictable. The strap maintained its position without being in constant contact with the user's foot, thus increasing comfort. The lesson here is that a claim may be non-obvious even though the prior art teaches all the elements if the prior art teaches away from the combination and the combination provides more than a predictable result. Next, we turn to rationale B, simple substitution of one known element for another to obtain predictable results. In order to apply this rationale, a skilled artisan must have been capable of making the substitution, and the result must have been reasonably predictable. Our first example of rationale B is Agrizap Incorporated versus Woodstream Corporation. The claimed invention was a stationary device for electrocution of pests that used a resistive electrical switch. This was considered obvious over the prior art applied. The prior art taught a stationary pest control device that was the same device except it used a mechanical switch. The prior art references also taught resistive electrical switches and handheld pest control devices and a cattle prod. Here is a figure of the claimed invention. And here are figures from the prior art. The figure at left shows the resistive electrical switch. The figure at right shows a handheld pest control device that used a mechanical switch. So why was the claimed pest control device obvious? It was obvious because the claimed pest control device was a simple substitution of one switch for another. Both switches were known in the art. The resistive electrical switch was well known and predictable in the art. The use of the resistive electrical switch rather than the mechanical switch used in the handheld pest control device solved the problem of malfunction caused by dirt and moisture. This problem also pertained to the stationary pest control device. Thus, the substitution would lead to the predictable solution. The lesson here is that analogous art is not limited to references in the field of endeavor of the invention, but also includes references that are recognized by a skilled artisan as useful for applicant's purposes. Another example of the substitution rationale is Muni Auction Incorporated versus Thomson Corporation. The claimed method of auctioning bonds over the Internet was held obvious over the applied art. The only difference between the prior art and the claimed invention was the use of a conventional web browser. The district court determined the claims were non-obvious in view of Muni Auction's evidence, even though Thomson argued incorporating a web browser would have been obvious in light of KSR. The Federal Circuit disagreed and found the claims obvious since there was insufficient nexus between the claimed invention and Muni Auction's evidence. The lesson here is that since Internet and web browser technologies had become commonplace for communicating and displaying information, it would have been obvious to adapt existing processes to incorporate them for those functions. Our final example of substituting one known element for another is Eisai Company versus Dr. Reddy's Labs. The claimed compound rabeprazole, a proton pump inhibitor, was useful for treating stomach ulcers and related disorders. Rabeprazole was found to be non-obvious over the prior art compound lansoprazole. Both compounds shared the same utility and shared a common core structure with only a difference in the substituent group. Lansoprazole had a trifluoroethoxy substituent and rabeprazole had a methoxypropoxy substituent. On the left is the claimed compound rabeprazole. On the right is the prior art compound lansoprazole. Both compounds share the same core but have a different substituent group. Rabeprazole was found non-obvious because the prior art indicated that rabeprazole would be less useful because the modification would reduce the lipophilicity of the compound, which was taught to be an advantageous property. Thus, a motivation or reason to modify lansoprazole did not exist. The lesson here is that a claimed compound can be found to be obvious if the prior art provides some reason to modify the lead compound to obtain the claimed compound. In this example, the prior art not only did not provide such a reason, but taught away from the modification. Rationale E, obvious to try, is not a new line of reasoning since KSR. The Federal Circuit stated in the matter of Cuban that KSR resurrects its own wisdom in the matter of O'Farrell regarding the differentiation between proper and improper application of this line of reasoning. The courts appear to be applying the KSR requirement for a finite number of identified predictable solutions, with an emphasis on predictability and reasonable expectation of success. Our first example of the obvious to try rationale is Perfect Web Text versus InfoUSA. The claim was directed to a method for managing bulk email distribution, which required selecting intended recipients, transmitting the emails, determining how many of the emails had been successfully received, and repeating the first 3 steps if a predetermined minimum number of intended recipients had not received the email. The prior art recognized a problem in the field of email marketing, which was a failure to meet a quota of email recipients. The prior art recognized three potential solutions. 1. Increasing the size of the initial recipient list. 2. Resending emails to recipients who did not receive the email on the first attempt. And 3. Selecting a new recipient list and sending emails to them. The claimed method was found obvious over the prior art. The email marketing method was obvious because the Federal Circuit found it logical to select a new list of recipients rather than resending the email to the initial recipients who did not receive it. Further, there was no evidence of unexpected results associated with generating a new recipient list, and no evidence that the method would not have been a reasonable likelihood of success. The lesson here is that when there is a reasonable number of identified predictable solutions to a problem, and there is no evidence of unexpected results, an obvious-to-try rationale may be applied. Further, common sense may be used to support an obviousness rationale as long as it is sufficiently explained. Another example of the obvious-to-try rationale is Rolls-Royce versus United Text Corporation. The claimed fan blade with a swept forward inner region, a swept rearward intermediate region, and forward-leaning outer region was found non-obvious over the prior art applied. United had argued it would have been obvious for a person of ordinary skill in the art to try a fan blade design in which the sweep angle in the outer region was reversed as compared with prior art fan blades from rearward to forward sweep in order to reduce in-wall shock. This is the claimed fan. The fan blade with a swept forward inner region, a swept rearward intermediate region, and forward-leaning outer region was found non-obvious for two reasons. First, the prior art did not suggest changing the sweep angle would have reduced in-wall shock. Second, the Federal Circuit held that changing the sweep angle would not have been obvious to try since it was not an option at the time. The lesson here is that an obvious-to-try rationale may be proper when there are finite and known options. However, if the options are not finite or known, then one cannot use this rationale to support a conclusion of obviousness. Finally, we will discuss examples of consideration of evidence from the 2010 Examination Guidelines Update. Recall that all evidence of non-obviousness presented in a timely manner should be considered when making a determination of making or maintaining an obviousness rejection. Thus, after receiving evidence in response to a rejection, you must reweigh all the evidence of record and evaluate if the rejection should be maintained. The key point here is that the evidence should not merely be evaluated to the extent that it overcomes the rejection of record. Sometimes evidence of non-obviousness may not be enough to overcome a strong prima facie case of obviousness. We will look at two cases that exemplify the principle that when evidence has been presented to rebut an obviousness rejection, it should not be evaluated simply for its knockdown value. Rather, all the evidence should be reweighed. The first example is PharmaStem Therapeutics versus ViaCell. The invention was directed to a composition comprising hematopoietic stem cells from umbilical cord or placental blood and methods of treating blood and immune disorders with the compositions. The invention was held obvious over the prior art applied, despite evidence offered by PharmaStem. This evidence included that prior art had not proven that hematopoietic stem cells existed in cord blood, and PharmaStem's own work validated the operability of hematopoietic reconstitution using hematopoietic stem cells from umbilical cord and placental blood. PharmaStem's specification acknowledged that it was already known that umbilical cord and placental blood-based compositions contain hematopoietic stem cells, and hematopoietic stem cells were useful for the purpose of hematopoietic reconstitution. Thus, there had been ample suggestion in the prior art that the claimed method would have worked, and absolute predictability is not a necessary prerequisite to a case of obviousness. The lesson here is that all evidence must be considered when considering obviousness. Evidence of non-obviousness may be outweighed by contradictory evidence in the record or by what is in the specification. Although a reasonable expectation of success is needed to support a case of obviousness, absolute predictability is not required. Another example of consideration of evidence is Hearing Components versus Shure Incorporated. The case involved a disposable protective covering for the portion of a hearing aid that is inserted into the ear canal. The covering was such that it could be readily replaced by a user as needed. The district court heard evidence concerning what the references taught, whether the teachings of the prior art references could be combined, and secondary consideration, such as the existence of a nexus between Hearing Components' commercial success and the claimed invention. Here is a figure of the patented disposable protective covering for a hearing component. Shure had argued the prior art taught an earpiece positioned inside the ear canal. Hearing Components' witness countered that only the molded duct and not the earpiece itself was taught as being inside the ear canal. The Federal Circuit found that the determination of non-obviousness was supported by substantial evidence. The witnesses for Hearing Components were credible, and their testimony was supported by particular examples, whereas the testimony by Shure's witnesses was sparse and unspecific. As for the secondary considerations, Hearing Components provided details of a licensing agreement to show the commercial success of its product. The lesson here is that all evidence presented in a timely manner should not be ignored, but rather be considered on the record. Evidence of commercial success is pertinent when a nexus between the success of the product and the claimed invention is demonstrated.